Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds, back again. We got Justin, we got Luke. We're talking about rods, and we're going to talk about what never to do with your fishing rod, and a couple places to never store them that many anglers mess up. And it's a reason that your rods aren't lasting as long as they should. So this was an idea Justin came up with it, or not came up with it. I guess you kind of did. But we get a lot of questions, and Justin's like, man, I keep hearing some of these questions about, should I store my rod in my boat? Should I store it in, outside garage? Should I store it in the AC? How do I make it last longer? How do I store it? How do I transport it? Right. Because that's another area that we did a podcast on in the past about where rods tend to break and why. And so we're going to talk about all of that here on this podcast. So Justin, take it away. Where do you want to start on this one? Storage?
I'm gonna make it a little weird. We're gonna see if we can put that camera over here. All my rods.
Well, things got really weird.
Office, away from the fan too. That's also important. But so to start off, I worked with a rod company in years past with Star Rods, and I learned a lot about not just construction and build of rods, but through all the different customers and people that I talked to, rod maintenance and rod usage. And I think that it's one of the simplest things that goes overlooked. I store all of my rods inside my house. And even when I was in a little one-bedroom apartment with my now wife, like we didn't have a lot of space. So it's frustrating to find areas if you're in a tight space to store these rods. But when you think about it, if you're an inshore guy and you got 2, 3, 4, or like me, an unnecessary amount of rods, you've got a lot of money invested in this. And it's the most important tool to you as a fisherman. Your rod, the way that it performs, I mean, it's an investment and you need to take care of it. But what people don't realize is a fishing rod, it's graphite or it's carbon fiber, sheets of carbon fiber, that within the carbon fiber sheets, when you make this rod, embedded in those sheets is an epoxy. And when these graphite sheets get rolled onto basically a steel rod or a steel mandrel, they're baked in an oven, and then the steel mandrel's removed and you have your blank. And what happens is all the other components that you put on top of that blank are held in place with epoxy. And in Florida, it gets hot out in the summertime, and it gets hot in your garage. And if you keep your rods in the garage, or you keep it in like a little storage unit outside, or you keep it out on the boat or out on the dock, I've seen so many rods that when I talk to guides or I talk to just people that live on the water and I see their setup and they had a broken tip, or they're bringing it back in to me and say, man, I don't know what happened to it. And I said, well, how long have you had this thing? Like, it's got grease and grime and scales all over it, and the cork is chipping away. And they're like, oh, I've had it for 6 months. I'm like, what? Like, I have my some of the rods I have for 6 or 7 years. And they're a little battered and the corks wore out on it, some VPRs I've had for a while. I've had these for, I think, 3 years now. And some Star Sieges I've had for 5 or 6. And I've just maintained them. It only takes me, a minute or two after fishing when I get off the water to keep them looking like new and performing like new. And I asked the guy, I'm like, well, what happens? Like, how did this rod get to that position? So, I go fish for the day, and then I hose off all my stuff and I go inside and I said, yeah, do you take your tackle inside with you? He said, no, I just keep it on the boat. And I'm like, oh man. So you've got the air, you've got the heat, you've got salt water. I mean, you've got so many things that can be.
Yeah, birds pooping. You got all kinds of
birds pooping. That's the most toxic thing on a rod. And I tried to explain to a lot of people, like, we take for granted because we think things are really durable. You spend $200+ on a rod and you think it can, handle having a piano dropped on it. And that's not necessarily the case. Epoxy can wear down. If you think about when people want to swap out the tip on a rod, what do you use? You use a lighter and a little stick of epoxy, and you burn that tip for a second, pull the tip off and put a new tip on. So epoxy is more variable than you think it is. Once it's set and it's cured, if you have long-term exposure for hours and hours of it sitting in your car or sitting in a garage or sitting in a storage unit, that heat is going to compromise the epoxy, and your guides could be loose. And the biggest thing that I saw was spinning reel seats. So a reel seat on a rod, what they're doing is, you take, like, this is, I think, a Fuji TVS reel seat. they're laying it over the blank and they're adhering it to the blank with a number of different things. It could be like long strands of yarn, it could be cardboard, it could be an entire like composite piece that they sheath over top of the blank. And then to attach the reel seat onto the blank, they're using epoxy. And over time, with heat and moisture and expansion and shrinking with different temperature changes, that's going to get loose. And to change out a reel seat is not fun. You got to chop it off. You got to pull the whole thing on. And if it's a split grip setup, it's a pain in the butt. Any custom rod builder will tell you that changing out a reel seat is not fun. The rod's pretty much compromised at that point. And a lot of this can be mitigated with basic maintenance, with making sure that you spray it down after being on the water and you take it inside where, the temperature in the house is somewhere in the 70s. I'm not going to judge how hot or how cold your house is, but somewhere in the 70s, perfectly fine.
Yeah, it makes a massive difference. Luke, you can see, if you're watching, you can see behind Luke, he's got just a fraction of his rods back there, and even more over to the side I see. And keep them inside. They will last years longer. Luke, you remember Dad's got a garage down in Placida. Our family has a condo down there near Boca Grande, had it for, 20 years now. And I made the mistake of leaving a couple of my rods, and obviously the reels were attached as well. I left them in that garage. Now, this is a sealed garage. You think it'd be safe. It's not on the water, but it's close to salt water. And just having that, and it's no AC. There's a little fan in there, so there's circulation. But just having my two rods in there for like a year, it might have been a year and a half, and that happens to a lot of people. You kind of forget about it, and I'm not talking about a decade. I came back and they're done. I'm talking like loaded with, rust. It looked like, how did this happen? It's like you see someone's skin who mostly stays inside and protects their, we're talking about dermatologist stuff earlier, with sunscreen versus someone who is out there like working out in the sun all day long without sunscreen. Their skin looks just weathered. The same thing happens with rods. So I would highly recommend, and I know it can get expensive and maybe it's tough to find room, but you can usually make room. Justin, you probably didn't know this, but Justin had probably one of the better Cabbage Patch Kid collections ever, and he had to sell his Cabbage Patches. It's an investment, but he made room for it.
So priorities.
Yeah, exactly. We get older, things change.
Yeah, not that much though.
I'll just go back with the dad story, because it just drives me crazy. It like pains me every time I go in there. He has a bunch of rods, but
a ton of rods in there,
and he goes through them really fast, like way faster than I do. And the only good thing is that we always know what he needs for Christmas, because it's a new rod, because all the other ones just get tanked.
They get destroyed.
It's just, yeah. And even in this case, it's in Placida, Florida. So it is very close to salt. But even being in Gainesville or Winter Haven, where I lived before, if it's in a garage, it doesn't, just if it's away from salt exposure, just that temperature and humidity change just constantly, day in, day out. Although it seems minuscule, and it seems more like the reel would be the thing that or the line that would be compromised, the rod itself is definitely up for long-term damage, and it can happen faster, and obviously the cheaper rods. But yeah, as Justin mentioned before, like, this is our number one tool for catching fish. The rod is the most important tool we have, and if anything, it's the one that we should be taking the best care of. And so, yeah, one tip is just to build, like I built little displays here, so I kind of turned it into having a more of like a ornament, if you will, for the room.
Artiste, you're such an artiste.
Yeah, in college, I would just I would hang them on the wall, right? Just get some nails and just hang them horizontally, and that look nice. It was totally out of the way, right? So instead of having to get a big painting, just have the rods laying on the wall. And then when I want to take them, I had a little loop knot, and so I'll just take the little loop over the nail, pull the rod off, and go fishing. So there's a lot of options. If you actually put just a little bit of effort into it, you can easily find some space inside to store them, because as Justin mentioned, it's just so important to do that.
I want to build on that real quick, because that's something I need to do here in this room. I have some 8-foot rods, like my tarpon rods, or if I'm fishing with big baits for snook, and I'm in a pretty tiny office here in one of my rooms, and I sometimes will lean a rod against the wall. Now, we take that for granted. I do.
I was going to ask you that, because when you move your camera, if you don't mind, because I noticed that you had a bunch of them that were leaning,
I was about to say
So
that too.
do as I say, not as I do, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
I do have some that are leaning. And here's the thing. One thing that I've noticed is during the wintertime, if I'm not taking out my big tarpon gear as often, okay, in this room, I can, as Luke mentioned, lay the rod to where it's sitting long ways across the room. Instead of sitting upright, like sitting horizontal. I need to put some nails up. Richard has the same kind of setup in his room. And the tip that's always sitting on the wall, even though I'm in a temperature controlled environment, if there's any sort of weird pressure, sometimes I'll look at the tips of my rods and they're off center ever so slightly. And it drives me nuts. I'll look and I'm like, man, I haven't used that rod in forever. Why is that tip off? Well, because it's been laying in a certain position at an angle. And over time, even though I'm in a 70-degree-ish house, that tip is now not the way it needs to be. And it's so subtle, it would drive me nuts. And I mean, I need to do it. I'm looking at it right now. I'm trying to make sure that they're like at an angle and they're not having a lot of pressure on them. But I mean, me myself, like I just realized that. And I don't know how many other people out there realize, try not to lay your rods with a tip against the wall, because they may deform. They're at that last guide, at that last tip, maybe off center. I have one with a bait cast rod I need to do as well, and just take off the tip, re-epoxy it, and get it centered and straight, and never do that again.
So what do you recommend? Getting something like Luke has where they're just straight up? Justin?
Yeah, I mean, a rod rack in general is the best way to go about it. I've got awkward reels. I have conventional and spinning reels on my rod rack. And I have so many now, I need to take my reels off the rods, because if I just have them on there, they're so bulky. This rod rack can hold, I think, 32 individual rods on it. So it's a pretty decent sized rod rack. I mean, Luke, your do-it-yourself rod rack was really detailed. And I don't know how much you had invested in that, but not a lot.
Not as much as your Cabbage Patch Kids.
That's
I got nicer wood because this isn't like a main room, so I got some like nice oak wood. So it'll cost like maybe $60 or something like that. Obviously, going to a lower end wood would save some money, but I mean, there's so many just pre-made rod racks. Like I got one on Amazon that I have for just the rod blanks themselves, just ones that I haven't used in a while, and that I'll probably use for casting contests and stuff. And it was like $20. So there's a lot of very low cost things you can do. The lowest cost is to hang it on the wall. All right. It's literally the cost of 2 nails and some mono string. Like it literally will cost you 10 cents to hang a rod if you want to. It takes a little bit of time. You have to tie it and measure all the lengths of the line. So it takes a little bit of time, but it costs nothing.
But you don't want it to be bowing where you have, you're hanging it up like on just the far ends, right? Because then you're kind of back to Justin's thing where it's leaned up against the wall at a bad angle.
Yeah, the one strand would come in around the reel seat. That's where most of the weight is, right? The reel would be on there. And then the other one I would do probably like maybe a third from the tip. And that way the rod just needs to be, basically when you look at it, if the rod is bending, that's a problem, right? You don't want that rod to be bending. So you want it just to be laying out nice and straight. And I did the same thing with my fly rod, right? 9-foot fly rod, don't have 9-foot ceiling. So you have to hang it vertically. And so that one I just had three nails and 3 lines connecting to it so that rod was just nice and straight. It's really not rocket science. The key thing is just really keep it indoors and just keep them where they're straight. And like Justin said, like no twisting, long-term sitting, and that could, again, the damage will be slight. They're not ruined, but you're just harming the most important tool in the toolbox, which is a problem.
Yep. Yeah, it's just the tip guide that's the problem, is when it's a pressure. Like if it's inside temperature controlled and there's always a little bit of a flex on the tip, I mean, the rod is baked. The epoxy and the graphite itself of the rod is not going to be compromised. It's the positioning of that guide. And again, like that was relatively new for me. I don't know if you guys had experienced that before by leaning rods, but I saw that and I was like, man, this is with like 2 or 3 rods. I got to now redo the tip on. I guess that's a good lesson for me because it's just the tip. I can fix it, take it off, re-epoxy it. But man, I can't imagine like, I don't know. It's just another thing on the laundry list I got to do now.
Another side note is in college, I was in Atlanta and I couldn't afford artwork, like this beautiful marlin painting here behind me. And Luke was the first one to do it. You did it in Gainesville where you're hanging up the rods. And I started doing it, and I noticed that I attracted more girls into my life. So the dating scene got much better, and I had really cool artwork, saved money on not having to buy paintings, and everything worked out pretty well. So let's move on to transportation. So we got the storage part of it, right? I mean, I would say it's a must do. Like, keep it. And here's the only exception I've seen where it might make sense, like fishing guides. Like the guys and gals who are out in the water every single day and they're getting free stuff sent to them. It doesn't really matter. I like Hollywood, for instance, they keep a lot of their rods, not outside, but in a kind of a somewhat temperature controlled trailer, but it's still technically outside, like a hot garage. But I mean, you're lucky as a guide having random newbies fishing on your boat 300 days a year to have a rod last, years. And it doesn't happen. But for everyone else, store it inside, find a place, even if it's up on your wall, even in your ceiling, right? I mean, like that retractor rack thing that we had a while back. I mean, that there is an amazing amount of areas in your house that are being underutilized, and you could find a way to put a rod in there. So definitely do that. And then don't store them like Justin had, where they're at a horrible angle where there's either a bow in it or that rod tip. I mean, that's really crazy. I'm glad you mentioned that. They could actually start shifting over time. Especially for us that, for a lot of us don't fish as much as we want to. It doesn't take that long for stuff to start moving, and especially in the heat. Gosh, it's horrible. So talk about storage. We mentioned this. I'm sorry, not storage, transportation. We talked a little bit about this with that guy, Brandon from Black Pelican, where he was saying, a lot of the rods that he gets to get returned, it wasn't from the damage of hitting a fan or anything like that. A lot of it was in transportation. People either slamming it in their truck door or trying to jam it in an area where it shouldn't have gone. What are your thoughts there? Just, I mean, you worked at Star Rods for many years. What did you guys see in terms of rods being damaged and not lasting as long?
Throwing it in the back of the truck and riding on. I mean, just right there.
Let it.
All those little micro impacts over time. All it takes is one good bump, and to have a fissure or a crack in a rod that you'll never see. And you go to set the hook, and the first, like, I don't know, 4 inches of the tip is snapped off. And they're like, "Oh man, I snapped it on a fish. Set the hook, big fish." I'm like, "Yeah, but there's lots of people that set the hook on fish all day long and don't break a rod. So what potentially caused that? Because most of the time it's not a manufacturer defect. A lot of these rods go through stress test before they ever make it into production and in somebody's hand. So it's not the blank itself. It's something that happened to the blank. It's an external factor. So, I mean, I've been guilty of it. Just like with laying the rods, I've put the rods in the back of the bed of my Tacoma. And for long distance trips, my dad's like, "Oh, we got to get a towel. We got to wrap the tips in a towel and bungee them down so they're firm." And like, that's okay. That's better than just letting them bounce around. But even as uncomfortable as it is, even with 8-foot rods, I still do try to keep it inside of my vehicle when I'm traveling. Makes it uncomfortable with the passenger if I have another person riding with me on a trip, but it's better to, when I have $1,000 worth of rods riding with me on a trip, I need to make sure that it's not gonna break. I'm not gonna have an issue before I even get to the ramp. Another thought is, I had this happen to me earlier this year. I have a very specialized offshore rod for slow pitch jigging. It's a crazy technique, and these rods are hard to come by. They're very expensive. And I was going on a trip dedicated for that type of technique. And I think I had my jig tied up to the rod in the rod holder while we were making a 50-mile run offshore. Little did we know, the jig came unloose from the rod in the rod holder while we're bouncing the waves. And the rod was bouncing around, and I lost one of my guides before we ever even got out to the ground. And I thought, well, maybe I could still use it. Maybe it'll just skip a guide, and I couldn't use the rod for the day. I was like, oh my gosh, all this preparation and work just because I wasn't mindful about having a weight or a jig that can potentially bounce off and swing around and cause ruckus on the back of the boat. And shame on me, I couldn't even use the most expensive tool I brought out there with me. And I still caught fish, but I could have caught so much more fish or a bigger fish or worked my jig differently if I had just taken the preventative measure on my end and removed the jig altogether before we ran.
Can you explain the ruckus?
The ruckus.
You-
I could probably make a whole dance around what it looked like about that jig flying around everywhere.
I didn't
That's
hear
a
no
movie-
ruckus. Do you remember what movie this is from, Luke?
It's a movie quote from somewhere. I'm trying to think of what
Oh,
it
this
is.
is a good old school 80s movie. There's a principal coming in to see some people in
Oh, yeah.
detention, and he's came in because of a ruckus.
The
I
Bueller?
just watched it.
Who made the ruckus? Hey, can you explain the ruckus, sir?
Oh, that's oh yeah, I was thinking Bueller. It was Bueller, right?
No,
What was it?
What?
no. Breakfast Club.
Oh, Breakfast Club. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, old
there's a
school.
pit.
We got Molly
That's right.
Ringwald, and yeah, that was a great one.
All right, back to the transportation, because Justin mentioned it, but I think this is super important. So it's not just jigs. If you're using any weight, especially Carolina rigs, if you're using a Carolina rig and that's where a hook is down and you secure the hook to like the hook keeper, and then you have a weight, say 12 inches or 24 inches above the hook. If you're in a boat, if you're riding from spot to spot, or if you have it in the truck, I personally lay my rods in the truck. I'm guilty of that. I do it every time and I haven't had any issues, but I just make sure it's not the tip that's laying over. It's like about a third down where it's a little bit tougher. But the issues I've had have been the weights that are swinging around and hitting the rod. That and if it's an ounce weight or so, that'll just totally break the rod or break the guide off.
Reason number 2 that Dad's rods don't last a year.
Yeah,
because he that place in Placida, it's a pretty short trip to Boca Grande Pass, and he'll go out there by himself trying to catch tarpon, and he uses those. I mean, those are ounces, right? Those leads.
They're 3 ounces.
3 ounces. Yeah. And he always has them right there in the middle of the whole 7-mile trip down. There's it's horrible.
So you have two if you're doing a Carolina rig, you either cut it off and just tie it on when you get out there, or just store it so that the weight is basically around the real seat, and then you put the hook up on a guide. So just make sure that you control the weights and have the weights down by the real seat, because if it hits the foregrip or like right above the grip, that rod is 30, like that the rod's not going to break there. But if it's hitting like midway up or even worse toward the tip, I mean, the closer up to the tip the rod is, that's where you just need to be extra careful, because that's where the rod's most vulnerable. So just that's the biggest issue I've seen, are those weights flying around, and that can do so much damage to your rod or to other rods that are next to it as well.
Yeah, I've tried to with that setup, if I'm chunking bait for redfish, I'll try to wrap the weight and the line around the rod a couple times, but it always unravels. So yeah, I either wrap it around the base of the reel seat or the handle. Sometimes guys that are running, like grouper guys, if they have it rigged up and they don't want to cut and retie, they're using 6 and 8 ounce lead sometimes when they're offshore. They'll open up their bail or put it in a free spool on a conventional, and they'll keep that weight and rig in a cup, in a cup on the boat, so that there's no weight that's like a counterweight that's going to swing around and cause the ruckus.
Can you explain the ruckus, sir? And going back to just the heat, even for an hour every single time you fish, if it's sitting in the back of a truck, which I do disagree with Luke, you probably shouldn't be doing it, putting it inside, I mean, it's so much better for the rods. And we see a lot of posts in the Salt Strong Fishing group, on the Facebook group, with people getting their rods stolen, and some, hey, what happened? Whoa, sitting in the back of my truck. That's almost the statement every single time, that it was sitting in the back of my truck. I just pulled up the restaurant, or I just went to go tie my shoe or take a leak, and someone stole them out of the back of the truck. Just one more reason to put them. That's why I have a Tahoe. I love being able to just put everything back in there and locking that sucker up. Anything else on that before we talk about just rod maintenance, kind of the third phase of this? Luke, anything?
No, I mean, just transport, and just be mindful of, just be careful, right? Any little nick can prove to end up having the rod break. So just extra careful.
Cool. So question, how often do you guys fully wax your rods in terms of maintenance? Is it just me?
I never do.
I'm just kidding with you. That's a trick question.
But my rods are not hairy. I'm not waxing.
No, you put a little sex wax on there, just like surfing,
Yeah. No, I don't go to that degree, but I do have a whole process of spray down and clean up after a day of fishing.
Right, let's hear it.
Okay, well, for kayak fishing or any kind of fishing, I'll set the rods up against the truck and I'll hose everything down top to bottom, just a light mist. There's 15 settings. I don't know what setting I use. Spray everything down. And the biggest thing is I try to make sure that the guides, because these is really the the little pivot area where salt can collect, is right there on the, where the guide meets up with the blank at that epoxy point. This is where I'm going to see rust accumulate most often on rods, is at this little point. So I try to make sure this is sprayed down very, very well. It's not the ceramic insert per se, because these ceramic inserts are polished. It's not the insert that's going to get rusted. It's the wire frame that meets up with the epoxy of the blank. It's that 90-degree or so angle that you need to make sure you rinse down very well and that there's no salt buildup.
So do you actually get in with your cute little pink hose and like spray all around? Like, what are you doing? Or you just
have a toothbrush that I go in with and I clean no, I don't actually do that. I just get up close, and like on a shower feature, I just shower from top down. I shower the top section.
That's what I was asking. So you go top down. Okay.
Yeah, I go top down. Gravity just kind of feeds and washes it down. I'll spray the whole rod, reel seat, cork, everything included. And I know that after a long time, if you get water and grime and buildup and oils, you're going to deteriorate the cork. Tony has a good video. I like what he does when he cleans his cork. I think he's used a magic eraser and some other stuff in the past to touch up the cork. But for like general maintenance, I'll then take my reel off of the rod. And while it's frustrating, and if you come back in middle of August and it's super hot out and you're tired and you just want to be done with it, I'll still take the extra step and I'll take the reel off the rod, and I will actually spray within the reel seat as well. And the reason is, when you keep a rod or keep a reel on a rod for 20, 30 trips, and you're just spraying that down, and that reel is always on that rod, just like with keeping a soft plastic lure stored on the hook, you're still going to get salt and material inside of this area right here. I mean, this threads up and down. Salt's going to get in and get trapped. And when you finally go to take the reel off the rod and you've had it out there for 30 trips, you need the jaws of life to remove the reel off there. It gets stuck pretty aggressively. So like when I'm jigging offshore and I'm going for 20-pound tuna or 30-pound amberjack, and I put a lot of heat and a lot of pressure there, and I don't take the reel off the rod, if I take, like I had a BG 4500, a BG MQ 6000 on some beefy offshore setups, not only do you have buildup underneath there, but you've got all that heat, and then you have temperature change, you have all that pressure on that reel seat. That's going to be another aspect that's going to contribute to a spinning reel seat. So I try to make sure that I don't have any unnecessary pressure on that reel seat when it doesn't need to be there.
That's good. Yeah, I'm willing to bet most people are not doing that, including me.
I don't do that either.
I mean, I do it on, but it's certainly not every trip. Geez, that's crazy. But I mean, if you want your stuff to last longer, it makes sense.
Yeah.
One little trick I do, I don't know if I know the best thing to do is after you rinse off the rod with fresh water, is to actually dry it off with a towel. That's the best practice, where you get the water off. I don't do that. It takes a while. So after I rinse it down, I just like have it, and I just like bump the rods like on my arm or something, or just give a nice little bump, and that'll knock most of the water off, just to help to what Justin said, where you don't want that water building up in those crevices, because that's when the rust happens. So if you just give them a nice little jab, obviously not too hard, you don't want to mess it up, but just give it a nice little impact, it'll fling a lot of the water off.
Yeah.
It's a lot quicker than actually drying it.
It's quicker than using a blow dryer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who has one of those?
Have an outlet.
Yeah, you have one. What do you mean, who has one of those? You guys both look like you use blow dryers.
I don't even have a brush or a comb, dude. This is all natural right here.
I wake up like this. This is natural, dude. So, I mean, for those of you guys out there that like, if you're grilling and you got the tongs and you got to click the tongs and make sure the tongs work, kind of like to Luke's point, take a rod, and when you're like, jiggling the tip or shaking the rod to like make sure the action still work right, you are kind of getting all the water droplets off it. So you might even do it and not realize you're doing it.
Reminds me of that song, that tong to tong tong tong. Is that how it goes? The tong to tong tong tong. All right. What else do we
I think you might need to read the lyrics, and you might see that.
Is that not it? It was like,
yeah, but yeah, Joe, I did go to the
guy who started Cisco, right? He was
I did go to the barber. I went to the barber a few weeks ago, and how do you like part your hair? Like I was like, I don't know. I literally haven't used anything in my fingers for this for this masterpiece in a couple years. So
You say just give me the butt cut, huh?
yeah,
Let's see where the part is. Take the hat off. Let's see
wherever
the
it
part.
falls, dude.
Oh,
Oh.
there it is. I see it. Very clear butt cut.
I'm like wheezing. I got him on mute. Okay. Anyways, so yeah, I mean, these extra steps we take on maintaining our rods, depending, I mean, it's not going to hurt you to be more meticulous. It's a matter of how much time you want to spend into it. Drying a rod with a towel, yeah, that takes a lot more time. That's pretty time consuming. Taking the reel off the rod, I don't know of a lot of other people that do it. I do it. I think it does make a difference because you've got all the pockets that salt can build up in. But in general, you know, a spray down, absolutely. I mean, even if you don't see the salt build up on your rod, which you more often than not never will, you need to spray it down and you need to make sure that it dries in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes I'll let my rod sit out in the sun for like 15 minutes. The Florida sun takes care of things. 15 minutes isn't going to compromise the rod. It's 6 hours. That's you know, over 5 days for 5 weeks. That's going to start, you know, wearing on that. But yeah, I mean, just take the extra steps. In the big scheme of things, you get into a pattern where your cleanup process after fishing, you spend all this time to like rinse your boat down and run out the motor and, you know, fillet fish or whatever the whole process is, throw this in there. It's negligible. It's 5 minutes or less.
Yeah. And it can make, I mean, it can make some of your rods go 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, I know, especially with some higher end rods, there's some that just aren't made as well, but you know, you get, and you should, it's an investment, right? If you spend $300, I'm talking about like nicer rods, even $450 for some of these custom rods, like Hollywood has some of those Biscayne rods that are, what do you say, 20 years old? I mean, 22 years old. It's crazy. And he works them. These aren't like collector's pieces that are sitting in his house. He's out there using them every week. So rods can last a really, really long time. And as Luke has hammered over and over again, we did a whole podcast on this, that the rod is more important than the reel. It's doing really all of the work, from casting to setting the hook, to controlling the fish. And I guess the final piece, we'll just throw it in there because we've talked a lot about the storage and maintenance and transportation, is just when you're fighting a fish. A lot of people, you know, that don't know the right way to fight a fish in terms of your rod should never be high sticking. They just assume, oh yeah, it's just what happens when you fight a big fish. I mean, both these guys, meaning Luke and Justin, and especially Luke, since I've known him forever, I don't remember the last time Luke broke a rod. He's fishing every single week and he's caught a lot of really big fish. Same with Justin in tournaments, a little bit tougher in a kayak sometimes. But I mean, talk about that, guys, about the importance of keeping the rod here and never way up here trying to fight big fish, especially.
Yeah, the 90-degree rule, never have more than 90 degrees of the rod to where the line is going, to where the fish is. And if you do that, you should not. If you do that and you haven't nicked your rod, it won't break. I've only broken one rod in my life while actually using it, and it was a fly rod. I was practicing the double haul. I guess I think I must have double hauled a little bit too hard, and the actual rod broke in the middle at one of the junctions. But yeah, never broke one while fighting the fish or anything. And it's because just always obey that 90-degree rule. Like when the times I've seen it happen, or when a fish is running under the boat and it's like human reflex, oh, I got to jerk it out and, like, you know, not let it get on the boat. That's when it breaks, because now the fish is directly below you. Now your rod is up, right? Now 90 degrees, now you're 180. That's goodbye. See you later rod. If it's a nice rod, right? Like you can go get one of those non-breakable ugly sticks or whatever, the wet noodles we call them, and it won't break, but I mean, you just won't feel anything. Like for those rods, the rods that can withstand that big torque, those aren't the sensitive rods that you should be using. It's going to really decrease the amount of fish you catch. So the nicer rods, unfortunately, are more likely to break. And so it's just that much more important just to take care of. But as long as you obey that 90-degree rule, no breakage should ever happen.
Yeah, like carbon fiber and graphite are totally different than fiberglass that's in like an ugly stick or an offshore rod that feels really heavy and has kind of a weird noodly tip. It's probably made out of a fiberglass, which is more durable. It has a different stress point on it. But yeah, the tip is not what's used to fight the fish, right? The tip is what's used to impart action in your lure. It's the backbone that you're putting pressure on, and you really get the most amount of pressure when you're fighting a fish when you have a rod more at a 45-degree angle or at a lower angle, anything lower than 90. Like this is the red zone. If you're fighting fish where the rod's straight up and the tip is bent out, doesn't matter whether the fish is way out or the fish is close to you, you're not fighting that fish effectively either. So it's not just about protecting the rod, it's about, knowing how to fight fish too. So just keep that in mind. Like the top 2/3 of the rod are not really what's applying power to your fish. That's why guys that go fish for tarpon, they always, end up having a really low angle and they pull sideways. They're not even pulling up when they're wanting to put a lot of heat on the fish, because they know that all that power is there at the butt section. That last, or the first third from the reel seat, that's where all the power is coming from in a rod, not the tip. Even if you have a stiff tip, that's not really what's embedding the hook on a hook set. It's not what's turning the fish's head. It's way, way, way down on the rod.
Yeah, and for those listening, the 90-degree for not a geometry major or whatever, it's really as soon as that the tip of the rod is pointing back toward the butt, even slightly, but especially if it's really pointing back down toward the butt, you have a big problem. That tip should always be the furthest away from the butt of the rod. So, and as Justin said too, if you're fighting a big fish like a tarpon or whatever, that was a problem that I did that Captain Hollywood corrected me on. As I was fighting, I was kind of not high sticking, but I was keeping like the 90-degree waiting on the jump so I could bow to him. And he's like, oh, no, you got to fight the rod, like fight the tarpon with the butt, not the tip. And then so I started doing that 45-degree, and I've never landed a tarpon so fast in my life. It was around 100-pound tarpon and got it in, and Joe was filming the whole thing. It was like 12 minutes. It was insane. And I've never had anything close to that before, because I was trying to fight with the tip, and in reality, that power is in that butt section.
Yep, that's awesome. One other final tip, and actually, I'll ask you, Justin. So, fill in the blanks. One of the most basic. I'm really going to kind of get this way. Cane blank. Fill in the blank. Some of you fish with pole. Yeah.
Cane pole. Say cane corso, like the dog, like cane.
I'm talking about the terminology on.
Luke already knows where I'm going with this. So cane pole, right?
Cane pole.
You guys in a couple weeks going to a mud hole to do what kind of building? Fill in the blank. You're doing, what is it? A blank building course.
Fishing rod
building. Yes. So here's where I'm going with this. There's a lot of power in how you communicate with your rod. Stop calling it a pole. This is a big deal, right? And we had a fellow on the team for a while there, and he kept calling it pole, and things started breaking. That's all I'm saying. You call it a fishing rod. Poles are for cane poles and like little kids. There's a reason they call it rod building, right? Custom rods, custom poles. What happened at Star Rods? You get fired on the spot, right? You start calling stuff poles.
You're not allowed to. You'll be kicked out of the meeting. It's called.
Is the company called Star? Fill in the blank.
Star pole.
Star pole. Oh, what are you guys building? Cane poles over there? Where do you get your sugar cane from? So that's another one. I'm telling you, it's detrimental to the rod, to the entire integrity. It starts falling apart.
Biggest cause of rod depression ever out
there. Yep. There's nothing worse than having to go buy pills and put it in the butt of your rod to make your rod feel better.
What has happened today?
This one's getting out of control. We need to go ahead and end this one.
All right, guys. Well, hope that was enjoyable. I hope you got a little bit of fun out of that. We wanted to make this fun because talking about rods, not to be confused with poles and storage and all that, it can be dry sometimes, but it's so important, right? Because this is not as fun, as exciting as going out there and catching a monster fish, but it's so critical to doing it. And it's one of the most important investments you'll ever make. And so if you like this and you want more of this and you want to save a lot of money on your rods and reels, come join us in the Insider Club. I mentioned Mudhole earlier. We've been building a custom rod for our members. This will be for members only. And we're trying to get this to the point, because we're cutting out every middleman possible. There'll be no retailers. There'll be, the only distribution will be us and our website. And obviously, Mudhole, who's manufacturing these rods. And so we're going to be able to cut out all of the excess fat and give you guys what we consider the absolute best inshore saltwater rod. This is not for bass fishing or even doing your deep jigging stuff. Justin, this is for catching inshore slams. It will be the best rod ever, and it'll pay for your membership just with this rod alone and the rod savings. Because when it's our stuff, we're allowed to give even more than 20% off. I will just give you a hint. It will be much more than 20% off of this this rod. And so got some really cool stuff coming here in the not so distant future, which is pretty awesome. So just one more reason to join us and the now 25,000 other inshore saltwater anglers who are part of the Insider Club. But the biggest part, of course, is trends. We have a lot of people who come in there and they see, wow, you guys got all the savings, and then you have all the community. So you got the tackle savings, you got all the how-to, and on the water tips too are just priceless. Getting to see all of our fishing coaches every week actually go fish new spots, and you get to see the pre-trip planning and the post-trip analysis and exactly where they caught fish, where the fish weren't, where the fish were, sometimes some surprises. And I mean, there's nothing better than seeing someone on the water actually, putting it all on to action. So come join us if that sounds exciting to you and you love a private community of thousands, tens of thousands of now anglers who are helpful and generous with their time and what they share. Then come join us. And you can find out more about that at saltstrong.com. For you current members, hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you guys so much. Really cool stuff coming your way. Pumped to share it with you. And if we can do anything to better serve you, let us know. Guys, this was a fun one. We went somewhat inappropriate, but you have to sometimes when you're talking about rods. Ta-tong, tong, tong. All right, peace. We out. See you guys in the next episode. I'm going to go download that Cisco thong song.